Mira Lane stepped off the transport ramp and felt the harsh wind of Kesra 9 sweep across her face, carrying dust so fine that it clung to her eyelashes. The other cadets straightened immediately, stretching their backs and rolling their shoulders as if the moon's thin air was nothing but a minor inconvenience. She remained still for a moment, letting her breathing settle, because she knew the trial ahead would not reward reckless bravado. She looked smaller than everyone else in the lineup, standing almost a full head shorter than the reptilian Goran beside her. The instructors barely glanced at her when they scanned the group, as if her presence posed no threat to the outcome of the endurance trial. That suited her perfectly. She preferred being underestimated. The endurance course on Kesra 9 was infamous even among the toughest academies. It combined jagged mountain passes, sulfur-filled canyons, and erratic temperature shifts that could drop by 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. The instructors claimed the trial measured raw endurance, but Mira suspected it measured something deeper: discipline, foresight, and the ability to remain calm when the body begged for rest. While the stronger cadets exchanged confident smirks, she observed the crates of supplies being unloaded from the transport. Each crate was marked with a color indicating ration type, hydration capacity, or thermal gear. She watched the instructors' patterns, how quickly the water crates emptied, how many thermal gels each species received, and how casually the large cadets dismissed the tiny nutrient bricks handed to them. She memorized everything, not because she enjoyed numbers, but because these tiny details always determined survival. When Instructor Harvek called the group to attention, Mira snapped into formation. Harvek, a towering insectoid with a voice that sounded like metal grinding over stone, delivered the briefing. The trial would last 5 days. Every cadet would receive the same baseline gear: a single pack, 3 hydration capsules, a thermal sheet, a multi-purpose tool, and 12 nutrient strips. No resupply, no external assistance, and no artificial rest stations. The group needed to traverse the canyon network, climb the eastern ridge, descend into the ash valley, and reach the summit plateau by dawn on the 5th day. Harvek's multifaceted eyes swept across the group as he spoke, but his gaze only lingered on the heavily muscled cadets who already looked eager to begin. Mira doubted he even registered her expression. She kept her breath slow and her thoughts clear, knowing this was the moment to absorb every rule, every limitation, and every opportunity hidden inside the constraints. As soon as each cadet received the issued pack, the group erupted into motion. Some strapped their gear haphazardly, others boasted about previous trials conquered on harsher worlds, and a few began stretching as if the trial would be nothing more than a prolonged sprint. Mira sat on a flat rock, emptied her pack completely, and took stock of every item with deliberate care. She weighed each hydration capsule in her hands, estimating how quickly each species tended to consume liquids under stress. She examined the thermal sheet's stitching and folded it into a compact shape that reduced unnecessary movement. She tested the resistance of each nutrient strip, noting how much effort it required to chew and digest. She arranged everything into the pack in a precise sequence that allowed her to access essential items with minimal wasted motion. Some cadets glanced at her, confused by her methodical pace, but she did not rush. Once Harvek gave the signal, the group moved out toward the first canyon path. The stronger cadets surged to the front immediately, determined to prove themselves. Mira kept a steady rhythm at the back, maintaining a breathing pattern that matched her pace. Slow inhale through the nose, longer exhale through the mouth. The oxygen content on Kesra 9 was lower than standard, and the thin atmosphere punished cadets who pushed too hard too early. She watched the large mammalian cadet Naro take huge strides ahead, already sweating under the relentless twin suns. His steps were loud and heavy, scattering dust with each impact. Mira's own footsteps barely disturbed the ground. She conserved energy not because she was fragile, but because she understood how the terrain would drain anyone who tried to overpower it. The canyon walls soon narrowed, forcing the group into a single-file line. The air smelled of sulfur and heated stone, and the temperature pressed down on Mira's shoulders like a weighted blanket. Several cadets began drinking from their hydration capsules within the first hour. She did not. She counted her heartbeats, monitored her pulse through the pressure in her fingertips, and focused on maintaining equilibrium. She knew that drinking too early disrupted the body's internal balance and wasted precious reserves. Instead, she chewed a corner of one nutrient strip, allowing her body to process the energy slowly while minimizing her water needs. At the first major hillside, the group paused for a brief rest. While the larger cadets collapsed onto the nearest boulders, Mira remained standing, shifting her weight from one foot to the other to maintain circulation. She scanned the sky, noting the position of the suns and estimating the drop in temperature that would follow in 3 hours. She observed the other cadet's condition. The Goran's breathing was already labored, despite his impressive musculature. The avian-skinned Zelri kept shaking her wings, trying to cool herself, unaware that such rapid movements would accelerate dehydration. Mira made mental notes of each weakness, not to exploit it, but to understand how long each cadet might last. Survival depended as much on predicting others' failures as predicting the environment's aggression. When the break ended, Mira followed the group again, still keeping her slow, controlled pace. She felt no need to lead. Her strategy revolved around longevity, not position. As the sun slid lower, the heat shifted sharply, producing a sudden gust of cold air that swept through the canyon. Several cadets shivered violently as their overheated bodies struggled to adjust. Mira had predicted the shift. She slowed her pace even more, letting her body adapt gradually, avoiding the shock that hit the others so hard. She pulled her thermal sheet over her shoulders for exactly 6 minutes, just long enough to preserve warmth without causing her body to sweat again. By the time the group reached the designated camping area for the night, exhaustion clung to nearly every cadet. Some argued about how to ration their supplies, others insisted on pushing forward before resting, and a few simply fell asleep where they stood. Mira knelt on the gravel, unrolled her thermal sheet, and organized her small shelter with quiet efficiency. She positioned it underneath a natural rock overhang that would shield her from collapsing ash and allow stable airflow. She placed her pack beside her head, arranged her remaining nutrient strips into categories by density, and reviewed the next day's terrain from memory. Her world narrowed to numbers: calories needed, hours of rest required, water intake tolerated, and distance achievable without strain. As she finally lay down beneath the overhang, she listened to the other cadets breathing heavily, tossing and turning, or arguing softly about who would lead tomorrow. She closed her eyes, knowing that none of them realized the truth she had already accepted. Strength mattered, but strategy decided who reached the summit. She fell asleep not with fear or doubt, but with the quiet certainty that she possessed the one trait that would outlast the others: discipline crafted from observation, not muscle. Mira woke before the first sun reached the canyon rim, opening her eyes to the faint violet glow that always lingered right before dawn on Kesra 9. She lay still for a moment, listening to the shallow, uneven breaths of the cadets nearby. Many had tossed through the night, unable to settle into a rhythm after the sudden temperature drop. She reached for her pack, slid it carefully under her arm, and sat up without wasting any movement. Her body felt stiff, but not strained. She had given herself the exact number of hours needed, and her mind felt clear enough to measure the day ahead. She pressed 2 fingers to her neck to count her pulse, confirming that her heart rate was steady. She let the confirmation settle her thoughts before stepping out from under the rock overhang. A pale haze clung to the ground, swirling in slow, lazy spirals. The sulfur smell was less sharp in the morning air, and for a moment, Mira allowed herself the small comfort of breathing without the sensation of burning dust on her tongue. She chewed another small corner of a nutrient strip, letting the dense energy dissolve gradually. A few cadets stirred behind her, groaning as they pushed themselves upright. No one spoke to her directly, but she caught glimpses of confused glances. She knew she would not be the focus of the group today. The strongest cadets would take over again, desperate to claim leadership. She adjusted her pack straps and prepared herself for the pace she knew would harm them. When Instructor Harvek announced the start of the second day, the group quickly formed into a loose column. The stronger cadets surged ahead, eager to reach the canyon's midpoint before the peak heat. Mira remained in the middle of the pack, keeping her pace deliberately steady. She watched the first sun stretch its rays across the canyon wall, illuminating cracks, ridges, and slopes that would soon radiate intense heat. She studied the shadows that shifted across the ground, showing where the last pockets of cooler air would linger. The rhythm she followed matched the movement of the light, rather than the impatience of the group. As the group began the long ascent toward the sulfur ridge, Mira noticed the early signs of fatigue on the strongest mammalian cadet, Naro. His steps, once heavy and full of confidence, began to slap the ground in uneven intervals. He inhaled sharply through his mouth, pulling in too much dry air at once, and Mira recognized the dangerous cycle forming. She watched him raise his hydration capsule again and again, taking large gulps that would only accelerate his body's decline. The slope ahead grew steeper, the air hotter, and Naro's movements became more erratic. Mira kept her breathing slow. She felt her own muscles tightening but refused to match the group's frantic pace. By mid-morning, the first sun cast a white glare across the canyon, transforming the terrain into a shimmering field of heat distortions. Mira adjusted her visor to shield her eyes, staying alert for signs of thermal pockets. The cadets around her began to pant, trying to keep up with the leaders. The reptilian Goran cadet pressed a hand against the canyon wall, his skin darkening from overheating. The avian-skinned Zelri flapped her wings in quick bursts, sending dust spiraling upward. Mira watched each reaction and let those observations confirm her early calculations. The group was burning through stamina far faster than the terrain allowed. The climb toward the sulfur ridge required navigating a narrow path carved directly into the canyon wall. The path angled upward at a punishing incline, with jagged mineral formations jutting from both sides. Mira slowed her pace even further, forcing her breathing into a 3-count rhythm. She placed each foot carefully, refusing to waste energy on unnecessary corrections. A sharp grunt echoed from above her. Naro had reached a narrow turn and tried to force his way through it too quickly. His boot slipped, dragging his weight forward. He caught himself on the rock, but his arms shook violently as he tried to steady himself. His chest heaved, and his breath rasped in quick bursts. Mira recognized the sound of overheating and rising panic. Naro attempted to push forward again, but his legs trembled with every step. The incline became steeper, and with one misstep, his knee buckled. He collapsed onto the path, sprawling onto his side. His hydration capsule rolled from his hand, tumbling down the slope until it disappeared into the haze. A ripple of panic spread through the group. The Goran froze mid-step, his eyes widening as he stared at the fallen cadet. The Zelri stumbled backward, nearly slipping herself. Shouts rose from the front of the group. Mira pressed her palm against the rock wall and steadied her breathing. She knew the collapse would disrupt the rhythm of the entire group. Instructor Harvek rushed down from higher ground, but even his long insectoid limbs struggled to maintain balance on the narrow path. He inspected Naro quickly, pressing a clawed hand to the cadet's overheated forehead. The instructor muttered a confirmation of dehydration and overexertion, but his tone held neither surprise nor sympathy. Mira watched the scene unfold in silence. She had predicted this hours ago. Strength meant nothing when discipline lacked foundation. The group looked shaken. Some cadets whispered among themselves, expressing fear about the terrain ahead. Mira adjusted the straps on her pack and continued focusing on her own breathing. She rested her hand on the rock to feel its temperature, measuring how quickly the heat was rising. The path ahead would only become harsher. She waited for Harvek's signal to continue, but she already knew she would not follow the group's pace when the march resumed. When the instructor cleared the path, Mira stepped forward with controlled movements, maintaining her rhythm while the rest of the group scrambled to regain order. The air thickened with dust from the disrupted climb, but she kept her breaths shallow and timed. She passed the collapsed cadet with a glance, but without slowing down. She had no strength to spare for emotion during the trial. Her task was survival, not comfort. As the group resumed its ascent, Mira noticed the psychological impact of the collapse. Some cadets clung to the wall for support, even when not necessary. Others began counting their breaths aloud, trying to force steadiness that refusal of rest had already shattered. The sun's heat intensified. Mira focused on the path ahead, studying the next turn, where a brief patch of shade would appear. She planned to reach it at the moment the sun's angle shifted, allowing her body to recover efficiently before the next stretch of terrain. By midday, the canyon's sulfur vents hissed softly beneath the ground, releasing bursts of heated air that struck the cadet's legs like invisible lashes. Mira felt each burst, but let her breathing remain controlled. She pressed one hand to her abdomen to keep her posture stable. She let the rhythm of her steps match her heartbeat. With each passing minute, she felt more certain that most cadets would not finish the trial. The terrain punished impatience and rewarded precision, and she was the only one who had embraced the second. As the group reached a small plateau overlooking the next descent, Mira finally allowed herself a brief pause. She crouched to examine the ground, which held traces of mineral dust that indicated cooler airflow beneath the surface. She inhaled slowly, letting the coolness rise through her lungs. Around her, cadets collapsed onto the ground, panting heavily and clutching their hydration capsules. Some muttered about the difficulty of the climb. Others stared at the path behind them, shaken by Naro's collapse. Mira stayed quiet, letting her body absorb the few minutes of calm without wasting energy on fear or pride. The second day had revealed more than the trial's brutality. It confirmed what Mira had always believed. Strength alone meant nothing. She rose to her feet, tightened her pack straps once more, and prepared for the next descent. She felt the weight of exhaustion in her limbs, but she accepted it without hesitation. This trial belonged to whoever understood the terrain, rationed effort, and respected rest, not the cadet with the loudest stride. She stepped forward again, ready to prove it. Mira took the first careful steps down the narrow descent, easing her weight into each movement to avoid slipping on the mineral-coated path. The wind shifted direction as she moved lower, carrying cooler air that brushed against her cheeks and brought a moment of relief. The plateau behind her grew quiet as cadets recovered from the exhausting climb, but she did not let herself linger on the sounds of fatigue. Her focus tightened into a quiet tunnel of observation and calculation. Every incline, every ridge, and every color change in the rock mattered. She needed to make her body last longer than anyone assumed possible, and the only way to do that was to turn the terrain itself into a partner rather than an enemy. The descent opened into a wide basin of cracked stone that stretched toward a line of dark cliffs. Mira paused at the base of the path, scanning the expanse. The ground was scattered with pockets of dust that swirled whenever the wind blew, and she knew those pockets indicated heat trapped beneath the surface. She adjusted her breathing once more and moved toward the left edge of the basin, where faint shadows suggested slightly cooler ground. The other cadets spread across the basin without any coordination, some rushing ahead, others slowing down to recover. Mira watched the uneven distribution of movement with a detached sense of inevitability. Those who pushed forward too quickly would lose steam long before reaching the next ridge. Her own pace remained steady. She kept her steps minimal, conserving energy. When the second sun rose, its sharp light cut across the basin, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the landscape. The glare forced several cadets to shield their eyes as they stumbled around blind patches of reflection. Mira squinted just enough to protect her vision without interrupting her forward rhythm. She scanned the terrain for signs of airflow and noticed faint tremors in the dust that indicated cooler wind slipping between cracks in the stone. She angled herself toward those cracks, letting the cool air lift some of the strain from her legs. By the time she reached the midpoint of the basin, the heat had intensified. Her shirt clung to her back, and a thin layer of dust coated her arms. She could feel her heartbeat rising, so she slowed her stride and counted her breaths until her pulse began to settle again. Her discipline kept her movements precise. She reached into her pack, removed a nutrient strip, and broke off only enough to keep her muscles active. She chewed slowly, letting the energy flow into her bloodstream without shocking her system. She did not drink water yet. Her throat burned from dryness, but she needed to wait until her body reached a stable rhythm. Far ahead, she saw the Zelri cadet push herself into a frantic jog toward a patch of shade under a low rock formation. The Zelri stumbled twice, wings twitching with every movement. Mira watched the imbalance and knew the cadet would not maintain that pace for long. A few meters ahead of the Zelri, the Goran trudged forward with determination, his clawed feet crushing dust mounds beneath him. His heavy steps left deep imprints, and Mira tracked those imprints to determine his exhaustion level. Each new step sank slightly deeper than the previous one. His pace was unsustainable. Mira glanced toward the right side of the basin and noticed a narrow, winding path marked by small indentations in the stone. Wind markers. She followed that trail, letting the airflow guide her. The breeze cooled her arms enough to prevent overheating, and she allowed herself a small exhale of relief. She adjusted her pack straps, redistributing the weight so the pressure on her shoulders remained even. No wasted effort, no unnecessary strain. Eventually, the basin narrowed into a shallow gorge that stretched toward the ash valley. Mira stepped inside the gorge and immediately felt the temperature drop. The walls blocked the harshest rays of the suns, and a soft whisper of wind traveled between the stone surfaces, cooling her skin. She allowed herself a few slower breaths to time her heartbeat. Her legs throbbed with fatigue, but she did not allow herself to acknowledge it fully. She needed to remain ahead of exhaustion, not chase recovery. As she continued, she noticed the terrain shift again. The gorge opened into a sprawling network of ridges that curved toward the horizon. The ash valley lay just beyond those ridges, and she could already see faint gray plumes drifting upward. The air tasted metallic, and she pressed her mouth shut for a moment to avoid inhaling the sharp particles. She reached up to adjust her visor and then examined the ridges more closely. She could sense the tilt of the ground, the angle of each slope, and the subtle indicators of where the wind carried cooler air. She mapped every element quickly in her mind. Behind her, a few cadets caught up. The Zelri reached the entrance to the gorge and leaned against the rock wall, chest heaving with ragged breaths. Her wings drooped, dust clinging to the thin membrane. Mira looked at her for a brief moment, recognizing the familiar signs of physical decline, but she did not speak. She could not spare the energy to comfort anyone. The Goran stumbled into the gorge several minutes later, sweat pouring down his scales. He looked at Mira with a mixture of frustration and disbelief, as if he could not understand how she maintained her steady forward motion. Mira nodded once, not to reassure him, but to acknowledge his presence. She continued moving. The ridges ahead required careful traversal. Mira ascended the first ridge with slow, controlled movements, gripping small protrusions in the stone to keep her balance. The wind grew stronger at the top, lifting dust into the air. She shielded her eyes with one hand and scanned the valley ahead. She could trace a faint pattern in the ash plumes below, marking where the wind's strongest. She needed to avoid walking directly into dense clusters of ash, as the particles would drain her lungs and force her to drink more water than she could spare. She continued forward, walking along the ridge until she found a gentle slope leading downward. She descended with deliberate caution, feeling each muscle tighten and release. When she reached the valley floor, the ground shifted beneath her boots, soft and unstable from layers of ash that had settled over time. The heat pressed down from above while cold drafts rose from beneath the ash, creating a disorienting contrast. Mira stopped and counted her breaths until equilibrium returned. She adjusted her gait to shorter steps, letting her feet skim the surface rather than sink into it. Throughout the valley, she noticed subtle signs of moisture trapped under layers of dust. The gray ash revealed darker patches of sediment, suggesting areas where cool underground vapor occasionally surfaced. Mira paused at one of the patches, crouched low, and held her hand a few centimeters above the ground. She felt the draft of cool air. She memorized the location. If she rationed properly, that pocket would allow her to recover without wasting a hydration capsule. As she moved forward, she felt the cumulative weight of fatigue settle into her limbs. She rolled her shoulders, straightened her spine, and forced her breathing into a steady rhythm again. She needed to make the remaining hours of daylight count. Her pace remained calm, precise, and unwavering. When she reached a small rise near the end of the valley, she turned back briefly. The other cadets were scattered across the terrain, some struggling through the ash, some stopping to catch their breath. Mira faced forward again, realizing she had begun pulling ahead without intending to. She had not tried to outperform anyone. She had simply preserved her resources. She exhaled softly, letting the realization settle into her mind like a quiet truth she had known all along. As the suns moved toward the horizon, casting a deep orange glow across the valley, Mira climbed onto a stable rock ledge overlooking the next section of terrain. She positioned her pack beside her, reorganizing it with the same meticulous care she always applied. She shifted her remaining nutrient strips into a new arrangement, placing the most energy-dense ones in the easiest-to-reach pocket. She folded her thermal sheet into a compact, reinforced layer, securing it to protect against sudden temperature drops that would strike once darkness consumed the valley. She checked her hydration capsules, weighing them carefully in her palm. Each fraction mattered. When she finally settled onto the ledge, she allowed herself a long exhale. Her legs trembled from exertion, but her mind remained clear. She had turned every step of the day into a small victory. While the strongest cadets burned out their muscles and energy, she had turned logistics, rationing, airflow patterns, and rest cycles into the tools that kept her moving. She looked at the darkening sky, feeling the cold wind sweep across her arms. She pulled her thermal sheet around her shoulders. Her body ached, but she embraced the ache without fear. She had survived the ridges, preserved more energy than she expected, and maintained the rhythm that would carry her forward. In the growing silence, she understood something profound. She was no longer following the group's pace. She was shaping the trial around her own endurance. And for the first time, she felt the possibility of victory like a faint spark at the edge of her thoughts. Quiet, steady, and entirely hers. Mira awoke in the deep cold before dawn, her breath forming faint crystals in the air above her. The rock ledge beneath her felt rigid and unforgiving, yet she pushed herself upright without hesitation. The muscles along her back were stiff from the uneven surface, and her legs trembled as she shifted her weight, but she kept her breathing controlled. She wrapped the thermal sheet around her shoulders for a few moments longer, allowing her body to adjust to the icy air before exposing herself fully to the morning chill. Every decision depended on seconds, breaths, and the balance between heat and loss. She folded the sheet with careful precision, slid it into her pack, and stood. The sky above the ash valley glowed with the faint promise of sunrise. Mira observed the color gradient spreading across the horizon, pale blue at the edges, violet in the center, streaked with thin bands of gray. The shifting hues hinted at the weather ahead. The absence of orange tones meant the heat would rise slower that morning, buying her a brief window before the terrain became hostile again. She needed to use that window wisely. She pressed her fingertips to her neck and counted the rhythm of her pulse, feeling the familiar determination settle in her chest. She descended from the ledge with steady, balanced movements, letting her muscles warm gradually. When she reached the valley floor, she adjusted the straps of her pack and moved forward, using the early cold to her advantage. The ash crunched lightly beneath her boots, and thin glimmers of frost sparkled where shadows had trapped the cold overnight. The second sun had not yet risen, and the air retained a sharp bite that forced her lungs to work harder. She kept her breaths measured, avoiding the temptation to inhale too deeply. As she crossed the valley, she noticed faint movements ahead. 2 cadets were struggling through the ash, their pace inconsistent and frantic. The Zelri moved in short bursts, wings twitching as she attempted to shake off the cold. Her thin frame was not suited for drastic temperature shifts, and her movements revealed the beginnings of muscle strain. The Goran followed behind her with heavy steps, his breath forming thick clouds in the air. Mira watched their motions with quiet attention. Both pushed forward through instinct rather than planning. She angled her path toward a narrow corridor between 2 low ridges. The corridor held pockets of still air, which would keep her body temperature balanced as the suns climbed higher. She used each smaller rise to give her legs brief rests without stopping entirely. Every moment counted. She needed to keep moving but avoid burning through her energy reserves. She identified a rhythm that balanced the cold and the upcoming heat, guiding her forward with mechanical precision. As the first sun rose fully, casting long shadows across the valley, the wind shifted abruptly. Cold gave way to a rapid surge of warm air sweeping down from the cliffs. Mira closed her eyes briefly, allowing her body to adjust. She loosened her shoulders and let her breathing cool her lungs. She reached for her pack and removed 1 hydration capsule, holding it without drinking. She waited until her pulse indicated a stable transition, and only then did she take a small sip. Just enough to prevent her body from panicking. She sealed the capsule again and placed it back in her pack. She continued toward the next ridge, feeling the first hints of fatigue settling heavily into her calves. The ground grew uneven as layers of ash blended with jagged mineral fragments. Her steps became slower but remained consistent. When she reached the base of the ridge, she paused briefly, placing 1 hand on the rock to absorb its warmth. The stone radiated heat from the previous day, providing her with a small boost as she prepared for the climb. She ascended with caution, using every indent in the rock to steady herself. The wind howled along the ridge, tugging at her clothing and loosening small fragments of debris. She pressed her back against the rock when gusts intensified, letting the force pass before continuing. Her arms shook as she pulled herself higher, but she did not allow the tremors to disrupt her rhythm. She reached the top just as the second sun broke over the horizon, flooding the ridge with an intense wave of heat. The heat struck her like a physical blow. The air felt heavy and dense, pressing against her chest. Sweat formed instantly along her hairline. She crouched to steady her breathing, lowering her center of gravity to avoid dizziness. She placed her palms against the warm stone and inhaled through her nose, forcing her breath into a slow, controlled pattern. The heat would only grow stronger as the hours passed. She needed to prepare for that challenge now. She shifted her weight and stood again, scanning the terrain ahead. A storm front loomed in the distance, dark, rolling clouds gathering above the cliffs. The storm brought unpredictable wind patterns that could disrupt the trial entirely. Mira tightened her jaw. She would not allow herself to become trapped in an exposed area when the storm reached the valley. She descended from the ridge with urgency but without haste. The slope forced her to brace her legs against gravity, and she felt sharp pain rise along her thighs. She powered through it, adjusting her foot placement to minimize the strain. The descent led into a series of narrow trenches carved by ancient water flows. The trenches provided shade, but created unpredictable temperature shifts. Mira entered the first trench and immediately felt the cold envelop her again. She exhaled in frustration, not fear, recognizing the strain this would place on her lungs. The trench wound through the earth like a labyrinth, with twists and sudden drops that forced her to remain constantly vigilant. The walls were slick with condensed moisture, and the floor held patches of loose stone. Mira pressed her shoulder against the wall whenever she felt her balance falter. She took micro-rests, 3 breaths, 1 shift of weight, another 3 breaths, using the trench's shadows to keep her muscles from overheating. The storm clouds moved faster than she expected. She could see flashes of violet light reflecting off the trench walls, a sign of Kesra 9's electrically charged storms. She needed to reach open ground before the storm descended into the trenches, trapping her in a cold and unstable environment. She increased her pace slightly, pushing through the burning sensation in her legs. The pain pulsed rhythmically, but she did not allow it to dictate her actions. When she finally reached the end of the trench network, she emerged onto a wide plateau that stretched toward the final ascent. The wind roared across the plateau with violent force, carrying dust and ash high into the air. The storm had nearly arrived. Mira shielded her face with her arm and moved forward, leaning into the wind. The plateau's surface sloped upward, and each step felt heavier than the last. Her legs throbbed with exhaustion, her throat burned from dry air, and her pulse hammered in her ears. She forced her breaths to steady, driving herself step by controlled step. Halfway across the plateau, the storm hit. A blast of cold air crashed into her, nearly knocking her to the ground. She crouched and braced herself, gripping the rock beneath her to prevent being swept sideways. Ash swirled around her in dense spirals, and her skin burned from the temperature swing. Her pulse spiked, but she maintained her posture, refusing to panic. She closed her eyes, counted her breaths, and waited. The storm's first surge always struck hardest, but its second surge would be more predictable. She waited for that moment. When the wind steadied just enough, she rose and moved again. Her movements were clumsy now, but still controlled. Her body screamed for rest, but she denied it. She kept her focus narrowed to the next 3 steps, then the next 5, never looking too far ahead. She used the storm's pattern to her advantage, moved during the calm pockets, braced during the gusts. Again and again, she repeated the cycle. At last, she reached a shallow depression near the base of the final ascent. She collapsed into the depression, chest heaving, limbs trembling violently. She covered herself with her thermal sheet to shield from the worst of the wind and counted her breaths until her pulse slowed. The storm raged above her, but she had found a pocket of stability. Her body was on the edge of collapse, but she had made it through the worst of the day's trial. As the storm finally began to move eastward, leaving the plateau quieter, Mira lifted her head. Her legs still shook, but her mind remained clear. She had survived the breaking point not through strength, but through precision. She pulled the sheet tighter around herself and turned her gaze toward the final ascent. The summit waited. She would reach it. Mira remained within the shallow depression until the worst of the storm drifted farther east, leaving only a low hum in the air. The wind still tugged at her thermal sheet, but its force had softened enough for her to breathe without fear of inhaling burning ash. She pushed herself upright slowly, every muscle trembling under her weight. She could feel the fatigue deep in her bones, a heavy ache that warned her she had crossed close to her physical limit. But she had also learned to recognize when exhaustion threatened her and when she could control it. She took 3 slow breaths, grounding her awareness in the rhythm of her pulse. When her heartbeat steadied, she folded the sheet carefully and secured it to her pack. The final ascent towered before her, jagged and steep, stretching toward the summit plateau bathed in a pale glow from the twin suns emerging behind the clearing storm. The rock face looked unforgiving, marked by cracks and sharp protrusions that would demand both precision and endurance. Mira tightened her pack straps and placed her hands on the first handhold, feeling the texture of the stone beneath her fingers. Her arms felt weak, but the weakness did not frighten her. She had prepared for this moment in ways the other cadets had overlooked. She inhaled slowly and began the climb. The first few meters were the hardest. Her body fought against the upward motion, her muscles protesting loudly with each pull. Her shoulders burned, her legs quivered, and her fingertips scraped against the coarse surface of the rock. She forced herself into a rhythm that matched her breathing. Pull, exhale, step, inhale. The pattern stabilized her movements and turned the climb into a controlled sequence rather than a desperate scramble. She used her knees to brace her weight whenever possible, saving her arms from unnecessary strain. She avoided looking down. Her world narrowed to the stone directly in front of her. Halfway up the slope, a shadow moved across her peripheral vision. She turned her head slightly and saw the Zelry attempting her own ascent several meters to the right. The Zelry's wings drooped heavily, coated in dust and ash. Her movements were erratic, driven more by fear than calculation. She gripped the rock too hard, wasting strength, and her breaths came in uneven bursts. Mira watched her for only a moment before returning her gaze to the path ahead. She could not afford distraction. She could not divide her focus. The wind swept across the mountainside again, stronger this time. Mira pressed her body against the rock and waited for the gust to pass. Her fingers dug into a crevice, and she felt the strain ripple through her forearms. The wind howled for several long seconds before fading. She resumed her climb, moving deliberately. Each motion was small but meaningful. She found another rhythm, one built around her exhaustion, not in defiance of it. Her movements became fluid again, not because she was strong, but because she had learned how to make weakness work for her instead of against her. As she neared the upper portion of the ascent, the terrain shifted into a series of narrow ledges. She stepped onto the first one and paused to regain her balance. Her chest heaved and sweat dripped down her neck. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat, but she refused to drink yet. She needed to save that last hydration capsule until she reached the summit plateau. She counted the seconds in her mind. 5 breaths, 6 steps, 7 heartbeats, and used those increments to guide her focus. The sun edged higher, warming the rock beneath her hands. The heat soothed the stiffness in her fingers, and she flexed them once before climbing again. The final ledge was narrow, almost too narrow for her to stand without bracing herself. She pressed her back against the rock, inhaled deeply, and pushed upward with her legs. Her arms shook violently as she pulled herself onto the plateau's edge. For a brief moment, she lay sprawled on the rock, staring at the shifting sky. Her breath came in ragged waves, and her vision blurred around the edges. But she felt the release of tension in her body, the subtle shift that told her she had reached a threshold she could now cross. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, then onto her knees, and finally stood fully. The summit stretched before her in a vast, flat expanse of pale stone, bathed in soft light that filtered through the thinning remnants of the storm. The air was still here, protected by the curvature of the mountain and the positioning of the surrounding cliff walls. A faint breeze brushed her skin, carrying the scent of cold stone and distant minerals. She let the sensation anchor her. She walked toward the center of the plateau, each step steady despite the fatigue pulling at her. She scanned the horizon and saw no other cadets yet. The Zelry was still climbing. The Gorin had not appeared at the ridge. Mira felt no rush of pride. She only felt the quiet satisfaction that her strategy had held. She reached the designated marker, a tall pillar carved from the surrounding rock, and placed her hand upon its smooth surface. The stone felt cool beneath her palm, grounding her in the present moment. Instructor Harvek emerged from behind a smaller formation near the marker, his insectoid limbs moving with a surprising level of grace. His multifaceted eyes reflected the shifting light as he examined Mira. He seemed genuinely surprised to see her arrive first. His mandibles clicked softly, a subtle sign of acknowledgement. He nodded once, signaling that her arrival had been recorded. Mira felt no need to respond. Her body was too tired for unnecessary words, and her achievement required none. She turned away from the marker and took a seat on a stable section of rock. Her legs folded beneath her almost automatically, as if her body had decided it had earned the right to stop. She removed her hydration capsule and took a slow, measured sip. The cool liquid eased the burning in her throat and helped her breathing stabilize. She let her eyes close for a moment, just long enough to feel the calm settle into her bones. As time passed, she heard faint movements behind her. The Zelry collapsed onto the plateau, gasping for air, wings trembling violently. The Gorin arrived much later, barely able to support his own weight. Other cadets eventually trickled in, each bearing the marks of exhaustion, panic, or overconfidence turned to pain. Mira watched them silently, her expression calm. She understood that each had fought a personal battle, but her own battle had been different. It had been built on calculation rather than force. When all cadets who could still move reached the summit, Harvek addressed the group. His voice carried easily across the plateau. He acknowledged the completion of the trial and noted the order of arrival. When he announced Mira as the first to finish, a ripple of disbelief spread across the group. Some stared at her in confusion, others in quiet admiration. Mira simply bowed her head slightly, not out of pride, but out of acceptance. She had known her strategy would work if she executed it perfectly. And she had. As Harvek concluded the formalities, Mira stood once more. Her body was sore, her limbs heavy, but her mind remained clear. She faced the horizon, watching the suns climb higher. The light illuminated the path she had taken, the basin, the ridges, the valley, the trenches, the plateau. She traced each segment in her memory, recognizing the discipline and foresight that had carried her through. She breathed deeply, letting the cold, clean air fill her lungs. The trial had challenged her in every way imaginable, but she had met that challenge not with strength, but with understanding. She had listened to her body, respected its limits, and shaped her strategy around its needs. In doing so, she had proven something that others had overlooked. Endurance was not a contest of muscle, but a science of survival. As she stood on the summit plateau, the storm clouds fading behind her and the suns painting the stone with warm light, Mira finally allowed herself to feel the quiet triumph swelling in her chest. She had not won through force. She had won through discipline, intelligence, and unwavering focus. And in the silence of the summit, her victory felt absolute.